There are places that feel wrong, not in an obvious way, like the scent of rotting meat or the sight of a gory accident. No, it's something quieter, something you only notice when you stop long enough to feel it. The general house was that kind of place. Everyone in the village knew it. It stood at the edge of town, a jagged wound against the skyline. You couldn't miss it, not with the way the cement-coated walls jutted out like broken teeth. Square holes stared from where windows should have been, black and vacant. The garage door leaned precariously, rusted and bent, as though the house itself was trying to vomit it out. There were no signs of life, no plants reclaiming the land, no animals scurrying in or out. It was as if nature had declared, this place is off limits. I grew up hearing stories about the house. Everyone did. They called it the general house, though no one could agree why. Some said a military general had planned to retire there, but he dropped dead before it was finished. Others swore it was a Frenchman, a recluse with a dark past. Then there were the wilder tales, a sorcerer performing blood rituals, or a man who borrowed from a creature that wasn't human. Everyone had a version, but none of them sounded real. Not when you were a kid anyway. Parents loved using the house to scare us into obedience. If you don't behave, the general house will take you, they'd say. And it worked for a while. But as you get older, fear mutates into curiosity. By the time we were teenagers, the house was more of a dare than a warning. We told ourselves it was just another abandoned building. Sure, it was creepy, but that's all it was. Or at least, that's what we thought. The government's attempts to demolish it were what changed things. I still remember when they brought in the wrecking ball. It was a big deal for a town like ours. Most people hadn't seen heavy machinery like that up close. Everyone gathered to watch. The first swing should have shattered a wall, but instead, the chain snapped mid-air. The iron ball plummeted to the ground with a thud that I swear I could feel in my chest. They brought in another machine the next day. This one broke down before it could even get started. Then a third. By then, people weren't whispering anymore. They were outright saying it the house didn't want to go. When the workers switched to manual labor, things got worse. One man fell sick and was cupping up blood within hours. Another disappeared entirely, leaving his tools in the dirt. A third slit his wrists in the middle of the night. By the time the mayor was found dead, face down at his desk, a cocktail of pills in his stomach, the house had become more than just a village oddity. It was a curse. For most people, that was the end of the story. They avoided the house even more than before. But for me, those events dredged up something I'd buried long ago. Memories that had no business resurfacing. The house hadn't always been just a creepy landmark to me. It was the last place I'd ever been with my friends. We were 15 that summer. Stupid kids full of bravado and bad ideas. There were 5 of us, me, Omar, Walid, Hassan, and Said. We spent most of our time biking around, making fun of each other, and talking big about things we'd never do. The general house came up often in those conversations. Bet you wouldn't last 10 minutes inside. Said said once, smirking like the smartest he was. I'd last an hour, Omar shot back. Probably find treasure while I'm at it. The dares escalated from there, each one more ridiculous than the last. None of us actually planned to go through with it. That is, until the day our math teacher didn't show up. It was a Friday, I remember that much. We were supposed to have a test, but instead, the principal shuffled into the classroom to announce we were free to go. By lunchtime, we were loitering at the edge of the village, debating what to do with our unexpected freedom. That's when Omar brought it up again. Let's check out the general house, he said, grinning like he'd won the lottery. The rest of us laughed it off at first, but then Said said, "What, are you scared?" It was stupid, predictable, and worked like a charm. Within minutes, we were making our way down the dirt path that led to the house. It was hotter than hell that day. The sun bore down on us, turning the ground into a dry, cracked expanse. By the time we reached the house, I was drenched in sweat, my shirt sticking to my back. But the moment we stepped into its shadow, the temperature seemed to plummet. Cold, Hassan muttered, rubbing his arms. We didn't respond. We were all staring at the same thing, a man sitting cross-legged by the front door. He was old, or at least he looked it. His hair was wild and gray, his beard matted and even. He wore layers of tattered clothing, even in the heat, and his skin was so pale it looked almost translucent. "Go back," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Go back, boys, you don't want to be here." Omar, ever the brave idiot, laughed. "What are you, the guard dog?" The man didn't answer. He just lifted one hand, palm out, and made a shooing motion. It wasn't just the words, though. There was something in his eyes, something hollow and haunted. For the first time, I felt a flicker of doubt, but Said pushed past him. "Come on," he said. "He's just some crazy old guy. Probably drunk." And just like that, the rest of us followed. I glanced back once as we crossed the threshold. The man hadn't moved, but his lips were trembling, mouthing words I couldn't hear. If only I'd listened. If only any of us had. The first thing I noticed when we stepped inside the general house was the smell. It wasn't overwhelming, just faint enough to make you question if it was real. It was the scent of something old and forgotten, like damp cement and burned wood, mingled with something metallic, like rust or dried blood. The second thing I noticed was the silence. It swallowed us whole, muting the world outside. Even our footsteps sounded wrong, as though the sound didn't have anywhere to go. "Man, this place is a dump," Omar said, his voice too loud in the stillness. He wasn't wrong. The inside was just as unfinished as the outside. There were no floors, just uneven slabs of concrete scattered with debris. Broken bricks, splintered wood, and shards of glass. The walls were bare, their surfaces uneven and pocked like they'd been abandoned halfway through construction. And those square window holes, they cast long, distorted beams of light that somehow made the shadows seem darker. "What's that smell?" Hassan asked, wrinkling his nose. "Rot probably," Said said. "Homeless people must camp out here. Like that guy outside," Walid added, grinning. "Yeah, probably his toilet," Sage shot back, and they all laughed. But I wasn't laughing. The air felt heavy, pressing down on me like an invisible weight. My skin prickled and my mouth was dry, but I didn't say anything. I couldn't, not without sounding like a coward. The house was bigger on the inside than it looked from the street. Or maybe it just felt that way. Every room was identical, a monotonous grid of cement and emptiness. No furniture, no decorations, no signs of life. Just gaping doorways and blank walls, like a maze designed by someone who'd forgotten the concept of home. "This is boring," Omar said after a while. "Where's the scary stuff? Bloodstains? Skulls? Anything? You want me to cut my hand and make a bloodstain?" Said teased, holding up a shard of glass. "Do it," Walid said, laughing. "You guys are idiots," Hassan muttered. Despite their jokes, none of us wandered far from the group. Even Omar stayed close, though he'd never admit it. There was something about the house, something that made you feel like you were being watched, even when you were standing alone. "Let's check upstairs," Said suggested. "Upstairs," I echoed, glancing at the sagging staircase. It looked like it would collapse under the weight of a feather, let alone 5 teenagers. "What?" Scared, Said grinned, the challenge clear in his voice. And that was all it took. The stairs groaned under our weight, each step sounding like a scream. I was at the back of the group, my hand trailing along the railing, or what was left of it. The wood was splintered, its surface rough and sticky. When we reached the top, the air grew colder. It wasn't the natural kind of cold either. It felt unnatural, like the house itself was leaching the heat from our bodies. "Holy shit," Omar whispered, stopping in his tracks. The rest of us froze, following his gaze. At first, I thought it was just another empty room. But then I saw the markings. They covered the walls, floor, and even the ceiling. Symbols carved directly into the cement, their jagged lines uneven and erratic. Some looked like letters from a language I didn't recognize, others were crude drawings of shapes I couldn't make sense of. "What the hell is this?" Walid asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Satanic shit," Said said, though he didn't sound so cocky anymore. Omar stepped closer, his hand brushing against one of the symbols. "It's cold," he said, pulling back as though he'd been burned. "Don't touch it," Hassan snapped, his voice shaking. "What's your problem?" Omar shot back, but even he looked unnerved. I didn't say anything. I couldn't stop staring at the symbols. There was something wrong about them, something that made my head ache the longer I looked. They weren't just random scratches, they felt purposeful, deliberate. And then I noticed the floor. It was the only part of the house that wasn't made of cement. Instead, it was covered in wooden planks, warped and uneven. In the center of the room was a square trapdoor, its edges marked with the same strange carvings. "Dare you to open it," Said said, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. "No way," Hassan said immediately. "Come on," Omar said, stepping toward it. "What's the worst that could happen?" "Famous last words," Walid muttered. It took all 5 of us to pry the trapdoor open. The wood was swollen, the hinges rusted, but eventually it gave way with a loud creak that echoed through the house. Beneath it was a hole, dark and deep, its edges lined with more of those carvings. "Someone go down there," Said said. "Why don't you?" Hassan shot back. "I'll do it," Omar said, grabbing the flashlight from his bag. He climbed down first, his movements slow and deliberate. The rest of us followed one by one until we were all standing in what could only be described as a basement. The air was different down there, thicker, almost suffocating. The walls were damp, their surfaces slick, something that glistened in the flashlight's beam. And the smell, it was stronger now, a nose-eating mix of decay and iron. "What is that?" Walid asked, his voice trembling. No one answered. The room was empty, save for one thing, a circle in the center of the floor, drawn in what looked like dried blood. Inside the circle were 5 objects, small, unrecognizable shapes, each one placed at a specific point. "Is this some kind of ritual?" Said whispered. Omar stepped closer, his flashlight trembling. "They are bones," he said. "Animal bones. Are you sure they're animal?" I asked, my voice barely audible. No one responded. The first sound came from above us, a faint scraping, like nails dragging across the floor. "What the hell was that?" Hassan asked, his voice rising. Before anyone could answer, the trapdoor slammed shut. We were plunged into darkness. Panic hit like a thunderclap, sudden, absolute. The trapdoor slamming shut left us in total darkness, the kind where your own breath feels oppressive. The flashlight Omar had been holding flickered weakly, its beam barely cutting through the gloom. "Open it," Sade shouted, his voice cracking. Omar scrambled up the makeshift ladder we'd used to descend, his hands clawing at the wooden trapdoor. "It won't budge," he yelled. It stuck. A deep, resonant sound came from somewhere above us. A low hum, like a massive machine winding up, except it wasn't mechanical. It felt alive, reverberating in my chest, growing louder with every passing second. "What is that?" Hassan whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't answer. None of us did. We were too busy staring at the circle in the center of the room. The symbols carved into the floor began to glow, faint at first but growing brighter, their red light pulsing in time with the hum. The objects within the circle, the bones, or whatever they were, started to shift. They moved like they were being pulled by invisible strings, arranging themselves into patterns too complex to follow. And then came the whispers. At first, they were soft, almost indistinguishable from the hum. But as the symbols' glow intensified, the voices became clearer, guttural, fragmented, like a chorus speaking in a language no human mouth should be able to form. "We need to get out of here," Hassan said, his voice shaking. "How?" Walid snapped. "The door is shut, and we're trapped." "Shut up and think," Said barked, but his bravado was gone. His voice was high-pitched, panicked. Meanwhile, the whispers grew louder, swirling around us like a physical force. They were everywhere, above, below, inside. I could feel them burrowing into my skull, prying into the corners of my mind where secrets I didn't even know existed were hidden. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The whispers weren't coming from outside. They were inside me. Then it happened. The symbols on the floor flared blindingly bright, and the circle exploded outward in a burst of red light. We stumbled back, shielding our eyes, but when the light faded, something was standing in the center of the room. It wasn't human. Its form was wrong, too thin, its limbs elongated and twisted at unnatural angles. Its skin was a mottled gray, stretched taut over a skeletal frame that seemed to shift and ripple like a mirage. Where its face should have been was a void, a featureless expanse of darkness that seemed to suck in the faint light around it. The whisper stopped, replaced by a silence so profound it was deafening. The thing tilted its head as if observing us, and then it spoke. Not with words, but with something deeper. An intrusion into my thoughts. A voice that wasn't a voice, but an understanding that bloomed in my mind like a poison. "You have entered uninvited." The other screamed, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen. My limbs locked in place as the creature's presence bore down on us. Omar was the first to break. He dropped the flashlight and bolted for the ladder, his hands scrambling for a grip. He didn't make it far. The creature extended one impossibly long arm, and Omar stopped mid-step. He hung there, suspended in the air, his body convulsing as though invisible hands were pulling him apart. And then he was gone, not killed, not dragged away, just gone. One moment he was there, and the next there was nothing. The rest of us lost it. Said started shouting prayers, his voice a desperate babble. Hassan sank to the floor, rocking back and forth with his hands over his head. Walid grabbed a piece of broken wood and swung it wildly, screaming at the creature to stay back. It didn't stay back. One by one it claimed them. Walid's defiance crumbled as he was pulled into the void, his screams cutting off abruptly. Hassan and Said followed soon after, their bodies dissolving into nothingness. And then it was just me. I don't know how long I stood there staring at the creature. It didn't move, didn't speak. Just loomed over me, its void-like face impossibly close. I wanted to run, to fight, to do anything, but I couldn't. My legs wouldn't obey. Then, finally, it spoke again. You will remain. And just like that I understood. It wasn't going to kill me. It had something else in mind. The next thing I knew, I was back outside the house. The trapdoor was gone, the markings erased. The others weren't there, but the man was. I saw him reflected in the cracked window as I stumbled away from the house, his gray hair matted, his wild eyes darting about like a trapped animal. It took me a moment to realize I wasn't looking at someone else. I was looking at myself. Decades have passed since that day, and I haven't aged a second. The villagers call me the madman, the crazy old fool who lurks outside the general house. They think I'm just a drifter, warning kids to stay away because I have nothing better to do. But they're wrong. I'm not here by choice. The house won't let me leave, and every so often, a group of kids decides they want to test their courage. They ignore my warnings, push past me, and disappear inside. I don't know what happens to them. I don't want to know. All I can do is sit here, chained by something I can't see, and wait for the next group to come, because they always do, and the house always wins.